In today's video, I'm going to tell you about 10 of my favourite drawing pens and pencils and show you how to use them. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find all things watercolour as well as drawing tutorials like this one, even a little bit of mixed media, business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell icon, you'll get notified every time I have a new video for you. I make at least one free video here a week on YouTube. It's free to subscribe and you can get extra content with channel memberships. So in this video, I want to take drawing beyond just using a standard pencil, although we're going to cover that too. Perhaps you've done a little bit of drawing, a little bit of art, but you're not entirely sure what else you could be using to draw with. Maybe you'd like to know more about which papers to use, get some hints and tips for using each of these new materials, and find out if it's possible to combine them with a little bit of paint. That's what we're going to do in this video. Make sure you watch until the end because by then you'll have a much better understanding of drawing materials, and you'll also gain some really cool tips and professional tricks of the trade for how to use them. So just before we go through our 10 different drawing materials, I want to explain to you which paper you should choose. So I'm going to go through 4 different types of paper that are available for sketching on. I'm going to give you some very simple rules so you'll always choose the right one no matter which materials you're using. So I've got 4 different types of paper here, so let's quickly go through them. So this top one is cartridge paper. Now, cartridge paper is a term that we use here in the UK, and I think it's used in Europe. Now, in America, it's not often used, and I get a lot of confusion. So please understand that what we refer to in the UK as cartridge paper is simply quality sketch pad paper. So if you have a sketch pad, one that you've bought specifically for drawing in, that's got nice quality paper, that's got, you know, a fairly thick feel to it and has a nice matte surface like this, that is cartridge paper. So if I do happen to use that term in this video, you'll know that I'm just referring to sketching paper. Now, how can you tell you've got a decent one? Well, as I said, it feels kind of, you know, fairly thick. It's certainly thicker than printer paper, but it's thinner than watercolor paper. It's got a matte surface, so it appears smooth, but it's not shiny. And although you can't see it, it actually has a texture to the surface, which is going to grab hold of the pencil. If you buy a very cheap paper or a printer paper, you're going to find that not only is it too thin to be resilient, but it's shiny, and therefore you won't be able to get very dark pencil marks on it. It's like the pencil just doesn't want to sit on the paper. And that's because it doesn't have this surface texture and this surface nap. So this is the paper that you will use if you're using dry media. Another type of paper that we've got is pastel paper. You can see this one's got a colour to it. Now, pastel paper varies greatly. Many of them are just too textured for doing ordinary pencil work on. You can see that the pencil doesn't sit on quite as neatly. This is actually fairly smooth for a pastel paper. Whether or not you can use it for any of the drawing mediums I'm doing today will just depend on the brand you've got. You can always just try out a little scrap like this and see how your medium works on it. But very often pastel paper is too textured for ordinary drawing. Next up, I have 2 types of watercolor paper. So the basic rule is that if you're going to put water on your paper at any stage, if you're using a water-soluble medium, or if you're going to add a little bit of paint to your drawing, then you ought to be on watercolor paper. Now, of course, that's not always 100% possible. You may just be using a sketch pad and you may want to do a little bit of painting in it, and that's fine, but just be aware that if you paint on ordinary sketching paper, the paper will become a little bit more fragile and it will wrinkle and it will no longer lay flat. If you're quite happy to accept that in your sketchbook, that's absolutely fine. But if you're doing something larger, a larger piece of work that you want to be more professional looking, then you can choose a watercolor paper. So this is hot press paper. So this is a smooth watercolor paper. It'll behave almost exactly the same as sketching paper. Now, it's more expensive than sketch paper, so there's no real reason to use this unless you're going to be adding water. But if you're starting to draw something and you're not sure whether to use sketching paper or watercolor paper, then just ask yourself if you're going to be adding any liquid, whether that's paint or water, at any point in your drawing. And if you are, you're best using a hot press paper like this. We now have a cold press paper. This is also a watercolor paper, but it's very textured. Again, you may find that your drawing medium doesn't sit well on here. I would never choose this for something like pencil or charcoal. But there are occasions such as watercolor pencil when you might need the paint to spread, or when you might be painting on top of something. For instance, if you're working in ink, you have to weigh up the fact that your paint is probably going to look better on a textured paper than a standard hot press paper. but it's likely that the initial drawing medium won't apply as well on a textured paper as a hot press paper. Sometimes you can find sort of a bit of a happy medium and get a textured paper that's still fairly smooth. So let's start with some basic ordinary graphite pencil. I'm going to show you how to choose the correct grade. I'm also going to show you how to use a blending tool. Now, if you haven't used one of these, it's going to be a real game changer for you. It's going to really level up your results. So let's talk briefly about pencil grades. Now you may have in your set some H grades. This one's a 6H. H stands for hard. Now the hard grades really are not much use for sketching generally, for artistic sketching. They're far better for technical drawing, for making diagrams, architect's drawing, draftsman's work, that sort of thing. So you don't really need these ones. In the middle of your range of pencils, you may have one that says F for fine. You may have one that says H for hard. And then you'll have a standard HB pencil, hard black. Now, HB is the most common pencil in the world. If ever you pick up a writing pencil in IKEA, or you get one of those free corporate pencils at a meeting, you'll find it's an HB pencil. This is really as hard as you want to go with a drawing pencil. It'll make a mark that is fairly light and very narrow and very sharp. It's very good for accuracy. It's great for botanical work. The downside to this pencil is that it may dent your paper and it's hard to blend, but they can be useful. After that, we get the B grade, starting at a 2B and going up to an 8 or 9B, depending on the manufacturer. Here I have a 5B pencil. You can see it makes a darker line and it's broader and softer and it will blend more easily. Here I have an 8B and this one will go even darker and is even softer. So with the B grades, all you need to remember is the higher the number, the darker and softer and smudgier the pencil will be. Of course, a smudgy pencil can be both an advantage and a disadvantage in that it smudges more easily, which can be nice for blending, but also can make a little bit of a mess on the paper. So now you know how to select the pencil that you want. Now, when it comes to applying your pencil, you can hold it a bit upright like this and perhaps do an outline. And then you can shade with it. You can hold it fairly flat to the paper and shade. Now you see that the pencil is skipping over the little gaps in the paper, but if they weren't there at all, it would be almost impossible to lay any pencil down, which is why your paper shouldn't be too shiny. An absolute game changer is to use a blending tool. I've got one here from Derwent, and what I can do is I can just take this across. What this blending tool is doing is it's pushing the pencil into the gaps in the paper to give us a much smoother, stronger looking effect. Now when you press very hard with a blending tool or a pencil, you're pressing down the tooth of the paper. It's getting pressed down and it can get to the point where you sort of have almost embossed the paper and you won't be able to draw on top of it, so do beware of that. But can you see how lovely this blending is? It doesn't have to be as dark as that, of course. We can go a little lighter. I've got my 6B pencil here, but again, I can use my blending tool. This blending tool can be sharpened just like any other type of pencil, and we can get a much smoother looking effect. You can even use it to spread the pencil across. Now, if there's one downside to pencil drawing that everybody complains about, it's the fact that pencil often looks very shiny, especially if you've got a lot of it on the paper. And when you sort of look at it from an angle, it looks really sort of light reflective and you can't quite see what's going on properly. Luckily for you, somebody has invented matte drawing pencils. I'm going to be honest with you, I've never tried them before today. The postman has just bought me some. So we're going to give these a go and see if we reduce some of the shine. I'm also going to show you another type of blending tool that you're going to find really satisfying to use. So here I've got my new set of Pitt Graphite Pencils from Faber-Castell. And one thing that I noted before I even bought these is that they go up to a much higher number. And this isn't the highest. I've got from 2B up to a 12B here. And they go sort of 2, 4, 6, 8. But they do the full range. And I believe they go up to something like a 16B. So they go much higher than a graphite pencil. I say much higher than a graphite pencil. I assume they are still a type of graphite. So let's try this very dark one. Now, I have actually heard mixed reviews of these. Some people love them and some people really don't. And some people say that, yes, they remain very, very matte on the paper. They don't go shiny. But then there are other people that say that if you use a blending or embossing tool, they will actually go quite shiny. They feel actually very much like using a hard charcoal. And let's try the blending tool. They certainly blend very well. We can get a nice smooth effect. I certainly can't see much shininess on the paper, but then I couldn't really see a lot of shiny with the other one either. I'm going to show you now another type of blending tool that also can be used with standard pencils, many other dry medium, and that's a torsion or blending stump. They look like this. They're made from compressed paper. You can sand them to get rid of any marks if you want to clean them up, and you can also use them to blend with, and they're a little bit more effective than the first blending tool I showed you at spreading things across the paper. So this tool is great for getting internal areas blended much more smoothly, but if you want to actually spread across the paper, then these torsions are a really good blending tool. You see how we can just bring some softness down, blending in this area. Much more effective than using your fingers, which should never be used really because of the oil you have in your hands. It's likely to mess up your paper. At this point, can I just pop in and ask you very briefly to click that like button for me, to click that thumbs up. If you like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment, YouTube will push this video out to more people. I'd love you to share it with a friend who's learning to draw, or even in perhaps an art Facebook group you belong to. I'm so grateful to all of you who watch me here on YouTube. So if you've just been using graphite pencils so far, perhaps you've thought about leveling up and going on to coloured pencils. You may have seen some really beautiful detailed coloured pencil work. Not only do professional coloured pencil artists use blending tools like the ones I've showed you so far, they also use an embossing tool to get fine lines. So let's learn some basic coloured pencil techniques. So I've got some coloured pencils here. If you tried these as a child and found that you really couldn't get much colour out of them and they weren't as nice as paint in any way, you really do need to revisit them as long as you look at the good brands, because they have really improved in the last few years and they've got far more pigment than they ever had in the past. And you can get some great effects with them. I've got two of my favourite brands here. I've got some Faber-Castell Polychromos and I've got some Derwent Coloursoft. Now, typically coloured pencil artists tend to own a lot more colours than painters might own. And that's because although you can blend colours together to some extent, they never blend quite as thoroughly as paints. And so there may be occasions when you just want to get the right colour on the paper. You can see here where I overlap the yellow and that sort of bluey lilac, we do start to get some greens. So you see you can blend them. And this is where your blending tools come into their own. The Derwent blenders work particularly well here. You can get some really smooth effects. I've grabbed a darker colour here. I'm going to show you how to use an embossing tool. So your embossing tools look like this. They come in different types. They're very, very cheap. You can also use nail art tools, which are pretty much the same thing. And what they're going to do is they're going to dent the paper. So we'll dent the paper here and then we'll sketch on top. And I've just changed pencil because I picked up the wrong type because it's in the wrong part of my little pencils bag. And here we have our embossed line. So what's happening is you're denting the paper to get a fine white line. And then when you apply the pencil, it's skipping over the top. You might wonder to yourself, what's the practical application of this? Well, it's fantastic for when you're doing something like animal fur. Obviously not the right colour here, unless we're doing some kind of tropical bird. But you can see the lovely texture effects that we can get with an embossing tool. And you can use these with graphite pencil too. You can also use it in watercolour painting, although in that case you'll get a dark line as the pigment sits in the dip. So coloured pencil work is done dry, but there's a type of coloured pencil, a watercolour pencil, that you can use with water. And I'm going to show you a really clever technique that's going to allow you to get a faded out, blended edge, because often when people use these watercolour pencils, they end up getting hard lines with them. I'm also going to tell you how you can tell the difference between your standard coloured pencils and your watercolour pencils. So I've changed to watercolour paper now because I'm going to use some watercolour pencils. Now, if you've got coloured pencils, how do you know if they're water soluble or not? Well, obviously you can try them out, but also you'll get some tips. Sometimes you'll see a little brush icon like this, or it'll say watercolour. It may say water soluble. Sometimes it has the French word aquarelle on. I may have said that incorrectly. It's always a bit of a tongue twister for me. And what we can do with these is we can sketch with them just like colour pencils, but we can also turn them into paint. So let's sketch some colours on here. And we'll put some of this vermilion on. And now if I take some water, I can blend them into paint. If I want to keep these colours clean and to remain the colours they are, then I can rinse my brush, or I can keep it with the blue on and spread it into the green. So lots of options there. How vibrant they are and how well they dissolve depends on the brand. And you can see we've turned these pencils into paint. Now, one thing people have trouble with is blending them out to a faded edge. So say I want to blend this up almost as if it's a petal here. If I start painting at this end, I'm just going to keep spreading that colour and spreading it and spreading it. I'm never going to get a soft edge. So what I'm going to do is start with clean water and come in from the other side until I hit the paint like this. And you might need a little bit of rag or something to dry your brush on if it's too wet, or a piece of paper towel like this. And we can manipulate our colour then so that we get a nice faded out edge. Another cool thing that you can do with watercolour pencils, which is one of my favourite ways of using them, is to draw into paint with them. Let's get some yellow. I can lay my colour on the paper and then I can draw in with a watercolour pencil. In this way you can get some beautiful fine lines. They're great for flowers, you can make grasses, even the edges of bricks. Watercolour pencils are really, really versatile. They're also great for your sketchbook when you don't want to take out your paints. Now you've probably seen work done with black pen perhaps and watercolour. Let's look now at how to use a liner pen. Now you can't smudge or blend these because they dry too quickly, but there are other ways of building up texture. Let me show you how it's done. So here I've got a drawing pen. Some of these are waterproof and some of them aren't. You'll need to check when you buy them. They normally state if they're waterproof or not. And if I'm drawing, for instance, a leaf and I want to do some shading here, I can't smudge this, but what I can do is I can do stripes. I can do cross hatching. I could even do, if I wanted to, areas with dots in. These are great for drawing outdoors because they're non-messy. They come in lots of different thicknesses. You can get different colours too. And one great thing about them is you can throw a little watercolour on top. So for instance, I could be drawing a landscape with some trees. And then I can take my paints and add a little bit of colour. And the good thing is you don't have to be very neat with this type of painting, because as long as you keep the colour light enough, your brain is always going to default to looking at the pen. So you can do some lovely light sketches in your sketch pad and throw a little bit of colour on. You'll never lose that original image of the pen, providing you don't go so dark that the paint is as dark as your pen marks. It's a fantastic way to sketch quickly outdoors. And of course you can combine them with watercolour pencils if you don't want to use paint. Now there was a time many years ago, just after the dinosaurs became extinct, when I was actually a schoolgirl and I should have been learning maths and geography. Of course I wasn't. I was sitting at the back reading Stephen King novels and drawing pictures. And let me tell you about my drawing implement of choice. It was what we in the UK call a biro, which is actually a trade name. You probably know it as a ballpoint pen. You'll be amazed at the effects you can get with one of these, and best of all, they're waterproof. So here it is, the medium of my childhood. I almost never drew with pencil. I always drew with a biro. In the UK, all ballpoint pens are biros, in the same way that all vacuum cleaners are hoovers. And actually, it's astonishing how much detail you can get with this medium. You can go over lines and make things darker. You can actually use it very lightly and get a very, very fine shading indeed. If you have a look on Instagram, you'll see people doing absolutely amazing artwork, graphic designs, even portraits with a basic ballpoint pen like this one. Of course, you want to use a good quality one because we all know the cheap ones are just very, very blobby. And amazingly, you can even use these for pen and wash work. Of course, I'm using blue here. It just happens to be the one I was writing with. But if you want a more natural look, you can choose a black one. And again, they're great for fast sketch pad work. You can even add a little paint Just like your liner pen, you don't have to be particularly neat when applying the paint because you're always going to default back to the pen lines. That's what the eye's going to see first, and so you can be much, much looser with your application of paint and work in a really quick way. Fantastic for traveling. Now with liner pens and ballpoint pens, you get a very quick drying line, one that you just put down. It remains the same width all the way along and it dries very quickly. When I do pen and wash work, I actually like to use an old-fashioned dip pen and acrylic ink, or you can use some Indian ink. This ink is really special because it stays wet for a little while before it gets dry on the paper, and so there are all sorts of cool things that you can do with it. Let me show you how to use it. I've got a cheap old dip pen here. You want to use one with a drawing nib rather than a calligraphy nib. Those are the square-ended ones. They're a little difficult to draw with. They're more for writing. This one's very old and quite gunked up. Somebody threw a bit of abuse at me last week, but I actually prefer using the mucky ones because I find they hold more ink. And I've got some Daler-Rowney FW ink here. This is acrylic ink. I've got this in the colour sepia. You can get black, of course, or many, many other colours. And I'm just using this little pot to put it in because it's easy to knock ink over. This is actually an old eyeshadow pot, and we can apply the line. Now the difference between this line and the liner pen is that this will gradually get thinner as it runs out of ink, and you can make a much more painterly line. I can press harder and get a stronger line. But the real advantage to this medium is that it stays wet for a few minutes. So I can take a wet paintbrush and spread the ink across. You can imagine how useful this is when sketching. You can instantly add areas of shadow in, like so. I can also do some cool watercolor effects. For example, I can wet the paper first. If I draw in next with wet ink, the ink will spread and I can get a furry line or some furry dots. If I'm ever doing pen and ink work, I almost never choose a liner pen. The only reason I've got liner pens is because I like to sign my artwork with them. When it comes to actually working in ink, I much prefer a dip pen. You do have to be a little bit braver with it. Of course, there's a possibility of dripping ink and all sorts of other things happening, but it's a really painterly medium. It's much more interesting. And yes, when this is bone dry in 10 or 15 minutes, I could put watercolor paint on top. Now ink is fun and you can get it in a whole range of colours, but it can be a little bit messy if you're out and you're travelling. What about a pencil that actually behaves like a watercolour pencil but has the colour strength and permanency of ink? Let me show you Inktense Pencils. Now a little while ago I watched a video that was testing out different types of watercolour pencil, and these ones came out top. These are Derwent Inktense. Now people make a big fuss about these because they're not technically watercolour pencils, they are ink pencils. However, they apply almost exactly the same. So we can sketch and lay down some colours. And then when we apply the water, they turn into ink. So you can see why they did so well in that comparison video, because they are incredibly bright and strong and vibrant, as most inks are, and have a lot more colour payoff and pigment than the watercolour pencils. So why do some people not like these? It's because they don't re-wet. So basically, once this little patch of colour dries, it will become permanent and it will not re-wet. Now personally, I think people make too much of an issue over this because usually when I'm using watercolour pencils, I don't really need to re-wet the layers anyhow. So it kind of depends on what you want and how permanent you want your work to be. And if you need to re-wet and re-lift underneath layers, you might prefer to use watercolour pencils. But these Derwent pencils are really interesting. And again, you can draw into paint with them like this and get some really cool effects. So we've talked about the difficulty of pencil and the shininess that you sometimes get with it. There's one medium where you can get it as black as coal and you'll never get any shine. It's one of the most beautiful and underrated drawing mediums. It's one of my favourites, and that is charcoal. People are often put off by the messiness of it, but if you're careful, you can keep yourself quite clean and also produce a beautiful drawing. And believe me, if you're doing something like life sketching, there's nothing faster. So I've got some charcoal here. This is willow charcoal. You get charcoal made from different things and you get it in different stick sizes. I've also got this tin here where I've got loads of old bits that are different thicknesses. You can snap them to get a fine point. You can make fine marks like this. You can shade like this. And you can really cover a lot of paper. You can use your fingers to blend. As I said earlier, it's generally better to use tools, however. Let me show you a couple that work really well for charcoal. So I'm going to lay a little bit more charcoal down. And here I've got a cosmetic tissue. What you want to do is fold it once or twice and then place it around your finger. Try and get it on a flat part. And then you can blend like this and get these beautiful, soft, smoky effects. If you're working in an area that's really tiny or small, like someone's eye, you can use a small brush like this. I've chosen an acrylic brush just because a synthetic acrylic brush will be a bit less floppy than a watercolor brush. And we can blend like this. You can even pick up with blending tools and apply elsewhere like this. You can see how you can get some beautiful, delicate, soft effects. If you're worried about getting in a mess, it's a good idea either to have some baby wipes to hand, or a more environmentally conscious way of doing it would just be to have an old piece of rag. I tend to cut up old t-shirts. Have that on hand. You can keep your hands clean. You can also, if you need to, lean on some tissue paper or some paper towel while you're working. If you're right-handed like me, it's a good idea to work sort of top left to bottom right, and vice versa. If you're left-handed, you really don't have to get in a terrible mess with charcoal. And it's one of the fastest, most beautiful drawing mediums. You can always get it much blacker and much more matte than graphite pencil. It can be hard to get fine detail with charcoal. That's where charcoal pencils come in. Beginners often get a little bit disappointed by these because they don't smudge very easily. They're actually best when combined with charcoal. Let me show you how to use them. So just for fun, we're using our coloured paper here. And again, I can apply my charcoal. You can see how it gives a much more textured effect because this is a pastel paper. We can blend. But I want to get some fine detail now, and I'm going to use a charcoal pencil. And I can use this charcoal pencil to get detail and fine lines. It won't spread as easily as charcoal, but it's a great medium to combine with my charcoal. And remember, if you're working on a coloured paper, you can always add a bit of white Conte crayon. So Conte is a type of soft pastel. It's a hard soft pastel, if that makes any sense. And you'll notice a Conte crayon is always, this is a tiny piece I've got left, but it's always square in shape, as opposed to the standard soft pastels, which tend to be a rounded shape. And again, you can take any kind of blending tool and soften and blend these areas. When you get dust like this, it's best to just lift your paper and tap it onto the side of your board or into a bin. You don't want to be blowing any of these mediums around because that encourages you then to breathe in that dust, which is not always good for you. And pastel pencils can also be used on top of dry watercolour. Again, you'll get a better result from using a hot press paper than a textured one. Now, I noticed in my comments recently that many of you are very new to painting and drawing. I'd love you to leave me a comment and tell me how long you have been drawing or painting for. Is it just a few weeks or indeed, like me, many decades? And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. I've got lots of free stuff in there for you. So there's some free downloadable PDFs. There's even a free watercolor painting course that you can take for no money whatsoever. You'll also find links to any resources and videos that I have mentioned in this video. And if you enjoy drawing but you find it hard to get accuracy and you're always making mistakes, I've got a really good video for you. It's really fast and easy to learn to draw. You don't have to do it all in one go, but I've got a video that's going to really get you up to speed. You can watch my 20 fast drawing tips right now.